Wild Tales is sponsored by Cotswold Outdoor. When we're out in the elements, we're in our element. And outside retail expert Cotswold Outdoor is helping more of us to get out with the right kit. Thanks also to their support, the National Trust is helping walking communities to access the UK's outside spaces. And we're working to fix 15,000 kilometres of paths and trails by 2030 for everyone to enjoy. Find your element with Cotswold Outdoor.
This thing is just so delicate. It looks like the slightest puff of wind would just knock it flying. But it's in some of the most hostile environments you can imagine, and it's just a survivor, it really is. And I suppose I feel some kind of affinity with it. There it is, hanging on the cliffs, doing its thing. And whenever I go and do my survey, I just talk to it. It's a good job I'm by myself. It's almost shaking hands saying, "Hello, how are you doing? Not seen you for a while."
The mountains of North Wales are a mecca for a sport that would make the strongest of knees quiver. But as our winters get warmer and the soil beneath the ice becomes vulnerable, how can climbers and conservation work together to save one of the UK's rarest flowers? I'm Ranger Rosie Holdsworth. Welcome to Wild Tales, the climbers of Eryri.
When I was a little girl, I always wanted to be a ballet dancer, and my dad wouldn't let me, and I was very upset. So perhaps I'm doing ballet dancing on the rocks. Love the movement on the rock, the apparent danger of it, the places it took you to, the exercise, the people, the whole thing really. And then I met someone who's as smitten as me in mountaineering, and we've just continued since then.
This is Barbara Jones with ice-white hair who springs up the mountain as if it's part of her. Barbara is an ecologist, now retired, but still dedicated to the mountains and the plants that make their homes there. We're climbing up the steep slopes of Cwm Idwal. The cold mountain air is howling across the lake that sits at the bottom of these huge rock faces. For Barbara, hill walking and climbing is tied up with the plants that grow on these imposing cliffs.
How did I get into botany? I think just going walking on the hills, and as you're walking you see, what's that? The plants just kind of came along with the lifestyle. The scrambling, the climbing, you see all these plants that a lot of people don't see.
Cwm Idwal is a place where the mountains can read time, treasured by geologists, and its craggy face provides a vital habitat. The cleft right in the middle of the saucer shape, that's called the Devil's Kitchen, because in bad weather you get mist kind of wreathing up, and people in the past used to think, "Oh, the devil lives there." So they called it the Devil's Kitchen, and that's the centre of the syncline. And where that syncline is, and all the rocks that have fallen from it, that's where most of the important plants are. Barbara moved to Wales after university and became more and more interested in the tiny plants she spotted whilst out and about. But there was one particular plant that captured Barbara's imagination. Her first glimpse was over 30 years ago, volunteering with the Nature Conservancy charity, when a mentor took her walking.
Everyone wants to see the Snowdon Lily, it's such an iconic plant. And I remember standing there talking to him, and I had my hand on a rock. And we were talking away, and he said, "You want to see the Snowdon Lily, don't you?" I said, "Yeah, I'd love to." And he just kind of... It was right next to my hand. I know exactly the place. This thing is just so delicate. It's a little bulb. It's got 2 leaves and a very slender stem and a little white flower on top. It looks like the slightest puff of wind would just knock it flying. But it's in some of the most hostile environments you can imagine, and it's just a survivor, it really is. And I suppose I feel some kind of affinity with it. There it is, hanging on the cliffs, doing its thing.
Barbara was told that the Lili'r Wyddfa, or in English, and as it's commonly known, the Snowdon Lily, was impossible to study. But her experience as a climber told her otherwise.
We were supposed to be protecting the Snowdon Lily, but we had absolutely no idea. Were numbers increasing? Were they decreasing? Was it on the brink of extinction? We had absolutely no idea about it because it was so difficult to access. So I thought, okay, I could do that. All you need really is a rope to be able to upside down and look at the plant. I go to the top of the cliff, fix a rope, and then upside down the rope. And I have special equipment that allows me to stop and take my hands off the rope so I'm completely free. There's about 20 subsites that I have, and at each one I stop. I count the number of plants there, the number that are flowering, and then I come back later in the year, count the number that have set seed.
So Barbara spent 25 years dangling over the edge of a cliff, hanging by a rope and counting these tiny flowers. Over time, she's built up a data set that tells us about the struggles of this Arctic alpine plant swaying in the wind.
And I look at that graph, that 25-year graph, and I think, oh, it's just a constant trend down. But then I think, more optimistically, I've been looking at them for 25 years. They've been here for almost 10,000 years, for goodness sake. And they lived through the Atlantic period, which was a warm, wet period, 5,000 years or so ago. They managed to live through that. So, it may be that they managed to live through this as well. And we shouldn't be looking at human timescales of 25 years. Really, that's just a drop in the ocean. We need to do it long term. I don't think I can do it for 10,000 years, but, it's a start.
Eryri is the only place in the UK that you can find the Snowdon lily. The history of glaciers is held in this little white flower. As the ice retreated, the plants followed. Elsewhere in the world, it's common. In most countries, it's known as the Alp lily. And by comparing it to the places it was common, Barbara learned a huge amount about its evolution, the possibility for growth, and its threats.
What it showed is that we're right on the edge of the range. We're not in an ideal habitat, but hey, it's hanging on in there, and it is producing flowers, it is producing seed, and what's more important is that these seed are viable. So there's all kinds of things you can learn just by counting the plants, the flowering, the setting seed, looking at the genetics, and you get a whole idea of the history of this plant, where it's come from, how long it's been here, what it's likely to do in the future. But of course, we've got the big bogey in the room of climate change, whether it's going to be able to hang on.
The greatest risk to the Snowdon lily, after perhaps sheep, is undoubtedly climate change. But there's something else on those rugged faces that is struggling as the winters get warmer. Something that makes best use of the cold, the dark, and the uninhabitable.
It's quite a scary medium to be climbing on. Like, when you go rock climbing, some of these rocks are 450 million years old, but ice comes and goes in a day.
Ice climbers.
The amazing thing about winter climbing is you just have such an amazing adventure. You can leave the car park and within 10 minutes you're just in complete whiteout conditions. And just the scenery, it's just the most beautiful natural formations that you can imagine. And you get to go really up and personal and go and climb those things. One of the best experiences was in here, in the back of Cwm Idwal. We lucked out that the very first day we had up here was some of the best winter climbing conditions that you could ask for. Everything was looking beautiful, super icy. You were coming up to the back of the Cwm and it was like coming into a giant playground. The climbing was just phenomenal and everybody was having such a great time up here.
This is Tom Carrick, Access and Conservation Officer for the British Mountaineering Council, or BMC, in Wales. He's also an ice climber. We're sitting looking at the back of the Cwm, gazing up at the sheer rock faces. It's not cold enough for ice to form, and you can hear the mountain waterfalls in the background. So Tom pulls out his climbing guidebook and brings up a photo of the glistening white mountain, with jagged shards cascading from the tops of the cliff.
This is how it can look. You can see the main waterfall. That forms probably one of the most famous climbs up in the back here, so that's the Devil's Appendix. It creates this amazing, chandelier coming down, and it's one of those routes that you sort of see forming. It forms because you've got little drips coming over the top and they ice up on the bottom of the ice, and you keep dripping more and more and more, and eventually that just grows through those cold conditions into a big vertical ice climb, and everybody's waiting for it to touch down, and then as soon as it touches down it's like a whisper that goes around the area where everybody's like, the appendix is in, let's go and climb it. I think it's probably about 50-60 metres of almost non-stop vertical ice climbing when it fully forms. But it's one of those really tricky ones that could be super dangerous if it's not properly formed.
So, question of the day. How do you climb up a 60-metre frozen waterfall in a world that's melting?
So you've normally got big B3 or B2 boots on your feet, so you're attaching your crampons onto those. And then in your hands then, you've, as well as some really warm gloves, you'd have your ice axes. Do you want to have them to be light enough that you can carry them and be comfortable with them, but heavy enough that there's some weight at the top that actually plunges your ice axe into the snow itself? And then if that's not a perfect placement or it's not frozen enough, you normally get this really nice sort of like thud when it's like the right conditions, whereas you get more of a squelch or a sort of slightly ripping sound when it's not perfectly frozen up. A couple of extra bits you'd be having on your harness. You'd be potentially carrying some ice screws. Imagine like a 10 to 15 centimetre screw that you wind into the ice. That's what you clip yourself onto, and so if you fall off, you're relying on that screw staying there and the ice not breaking. Ideally, when you're going ice climbing, falling off is generally pretty bad. You try to avoid it. You've got lots of sharp things on you, and generally in winter climbing it's quite hard to find good gear, so that's like the protection you're putting into the rock to stop you from taking big falls. It's hard to find. If you do fall off in winter, you're potentially going quite a long way, so there's so much to take in and try to understand when you're going winter climbing to try and make those the best judgments you can.
So you swing your axe in, thud your crampons into the ice. Ice climbing is a potentially dangerous sport at the best of times, but Barbara, who's seen these mountains change, spotted a problem.
When we used to have proper winters, we had really good winters where you got a lot of ice build up, a lot of snow, and there are a lot of climbers around. And if you have a good thick cover of snow and ice, then people can climb up that and they're not impacting what's growing underneath there. I started to become a bit worried when I saw people climbing when we had not a thick cover of snow and ice. I thought, well, if their crampons or their ice axes go through there, they could start to impact the plants. And the places that they climb are the places that are important botanically, usually, because they're north-facing, they're cold, they're wet, and that's exactly what you want for the ice climbing, because the ice will build up there. So there's a potential for a big impact.
And so if we look up on the cliffs on the left-hand side of Devil's Kitchen itself, you can see the more greeny gullies. And those are probably starting to get into what would sort of like be sort of quite turfy-esque routes. You can see all the grass and the greenery that's on there at the moment. And those are sort of some of the key routes that you'd be like, right, we need the turf to be really well frozen for that. Because, I mean, if you climb that now and if you put an ice axe into it, like, it's just going to rip straight through the soil.
So herein lies the problem. The warmer winters mean that ice climbing is less safe for people and plants. The reality of ice climbing is you don't know what's going on underneath the surface. What looks frozen from 30 metres below looks different when you're close up. But for Barbara, Tom and everyone else working on the mountains, they know how important these sports are for people.
So I talked with some people and we arranged to have some sensors to put up in Cwm Idwal here. And the idea of these was that you'd be able to get temperature information from the surface and from below the surface. And this information would be able to be put on the BMC website. So if someone sitting in Birmingham or London would think, right, I want to go ice climbing in North Wales this weekend, what's the temperature like? So they'd look on these graphs and think, it's a bit warm, it's not frozen there, so perhaps that's not a good idea.
Yeah, so putting in so the first two, so we're in the back of Cwm Idwal at the moment. So we've got one sensor in here, it's about 650 metres. We've got one in Cwm Cynaifion, which is well over to our left, up in a higher cwm. So that's under another area of winter climbing called Cwm Idwal, the Black Cliffs. That's at 850 metres. And then we've got one then over on Clogwyn Garnedd, which is on a Wyddfa, Snowdon, which is at about 850 metres as well, and that's on the bottom of what's known as the Trinity Gullies. So we've chosen these three locations as probably the three most popular areas to go climbing, and they're really, really simple. It's a box with an antenna sticking out the top. It's got an ambient air temperature sensor as well on there, so there's a little sort of like cone on the top of it, so that's giving us an air temperature. And then you've got three wires then that go into the ground, one going down to 5, one going down to 10, and one going down to 30. So the 5 is sort of roughly the depth of your crampons going in, 10, 15 centimetres roughly where your adze, the spiky bit of your ice axe is going into, and then the 30 is sort of just generally out of interest to see how deep the soil is freezing down to. The other really great thing about it now is from the 2 sites we've got here, we've got 12 years of climate change data in turf temperature sensors, which we quite often share with whether it's Bangor University or local college groups. And if they want to look at sort of the changing patterns of our winters or temperatures, it's a resource not just for climbers.
The sensors mean that ice climbers can check the conditions without even leaving the house, on their phone, then again at the bottom of the mountain. This not only makes it much safer to ensure people climb in the right conditions, but it's had a surprising benefit for the precious Snowdon Lily too.
And the conversation between the climbers now has worked really well. People are really, really starting to take notice. And it had to happen because when I was working in conservation, the people I was working with, some of them said, right, we've got to stop this climbing. You know, it's obviously going to affect the plants. You say, well, hang on a minute. You know, it's an important thing for some people. Let's see what we can do. And what we've done has been brilliant.
Even with the sensors, Tom tells me that you need to check every step of the way. As climbers are taking on worse conditions, the Snowdon Lily is too.
There is nothing better than winter climbing. Like, it is just such a stunning thing to do. But coming climbing is a recreational thing. It's not something we have to do. And a lot of the plants that live in these locations, whether it's plants or animals, like, this is the only places they've got to live. And it's their home. And we've got to be as respectful as possible for those places and those plants and animals, because they can't move anywhere. And if anything, the locations they've got to live are becoming fewer and fewer and fewer, with climate change particularly pushing the Arctic alpine plants towards the summits and eventually to extinction. And it's really sad. I think on the other side of that, though, is if we don't get exposed to these places and the opportunities to go and experience nature, then we forget why we care about it. I get all these opportunities to work with these amazing people like Barbara Jones, and then you learn more and more and more, and then you become more and more intrigued. And it's quite similar to the sort of the adventurous reasons why we want to go climbing. You have this want and burn for knowledge, don't you, that you want to go and learn more about these things as you become more and more aware of them.
So the sensors have been a success, appreciated by botanists and climbers alike. But what does the future hold for one of the UK's rarest and most ancient flowers, with the big bogey of the climate crisis still in the room?
A lot of these plants are growing on steep north-facing cliffs, so they're a bit buffered from climate change, and some of them have adaptability. So I'm hoping that if we do manage to get bigger populations, that, you know, they will be able to hang on. It may be that we have to accept that we're going to lose some of these things here, but not without a big fight. I'm not wanting to think of things like that at the moment, because what we're really trying to do is protect what we've got here. And the first moves we've made in this place, in Cwm Idwal, 20 odd years ago, by drastically reducing the grazing so that the plants have a little bit more space to move. And it's working at the back of the Cwm there. You're already getting lots of saxifrages growing on the slopes. But because these plants are so slow growing and in such small populations, it's taking a while for them to come off the cliffs. So, you know, we can't expect anything much for about 50 years or so. So just fingers crossed, and let's hope the climate doesn't change that much, that they just give up the fight.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Wild Tales. To hear more about an incredible selection of Arctic alpine plants from Barbara, head to our Instagram @WildTalesNT. To see the temperature sensors at Cwm Idwal or find out more about the work between climbing and conservation, head to the BMC website. Wild Tales is sponsored by Cotswold Outdoor, your outside retailer and epic guides to adventure. Quick breathers, calming walks, or heart-pounding hikes, we feel better when we get out more. Find quality kit and 50 years of outdoor wisdom. Plus, National Trust supporters get 15% off walking kit in-store and online. Feel in your element, in the elements at cotswoldoutdoor.com.